Okay, so HS2, um, seems like we need to tackle this one head on.
It's a big one.
It is a big one. You've sent us a ton of stuff on this, articles, reports, even some tweets, it seems like.
Yeah, there's been a lot going on.
Yeah, so clearly people are looking for the signal in all the noise when it comes to HS2.
Definitely a lot of noise around this topic.
So that's our mission today, to cut through all of that and really try to figure out what is the story with HS2.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of different perspectives and angles to this, which makes it all the more interesting.
For sure. So let's do this. Let's start with a really quick history of the project just to get everybody on the same page.
Okay, sounds good.
So for anyone who's been living under a rock for the past, I don't know, 15 years,
Yeah.
can you give us like the SparkNotes version of HS2? What is it? Where did it come from?
Okay, so the SparkNotes version, it all started back in 2009, actually, under a Labor government. And the idea at the time was really ambitious. It was this Y-shaped network of high-speed rail that would connect London all the way up to Manchester and Leeds. And we're talking high-speed, 225 miles per hour was the dream.
Wow.
So really trying to revolutionize travel in the UK. The goal is faster journeys, obviously more train passengers, less reliance on cars and planes. A lot of positives in theory.
Yeah. Sounds pretty dreamy, at least on paper.
It does sound good in theory.
So what happened?
Well, reality set in.
As it tends to do.
Exactly. And I guess the first sort of major shakeup came in November 2021 with what was called the Integrated Rail Plan. And this plan actually significantly scaled back the eastern leg of HS2. So that's the part that was supposed to go up to Leeds.
Oh, okay.
So already we're starting to see some changes to that initial vision.
Yeah, not quite as ambitious as it once was.
Right. And then just to make things even more complicated.
Or there's more.
Oh, yeah. In October 2023.
Okay.
Very recently, a really pivotal moment in the HS2 saga. The government basically dropped a bombshell and said that phase 2 of the project, which included that eastern leg, but also the leg going up to Manchester, that was being scrapped completely.
Oh, wow.
So gone kaput.
So not the full Y anymore.
No, not at all. More like a line segment.
So from Grand Vision to line segment, what are we actually left with for HS2?
Okay, so what we're actually getting is Swirling 1. And this will run from London to a place called Handsaker, which is just north of Birmingham.
Handsaker. Okay, I've never heard of it, but continue.
Yeah, it's not exactly a major city.
Right.
But there will also be a branch line that splits off from that main line to Birmingham Curzon Street Station in the city center.
Okay. And speaking of stations, I did hear there is kind of a cool detail about Curzon Street.
Yes, they are actually planning to reuse and renovate the historic Curzon Street Station building.
Oh, wow.
Which I think is a really nice touch.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to weave in a little bit of history into this very modern project.
Exactly, a little nod to the past.
I like it. So, okay, but back to Handsaker for a second. Even though it's not the final destination anymore, it's still a pretty important spot, right?
It is, because this is where HS2 is going to shake hands with the existing West Coast main line. So that's the main railway line that runs up the western side of the country.
I see. So even though those brand new HS2 tracks end there, passengers can still continue further north by connecting to those existing lines.
Exactly. It won't be quite as fast, obviously,
Right.
but it's still a major improvement for those regions.
Makes sense. Okay, so that's how they're getting around that whole shortening the line issue.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the stations along this route. You mentioned Curzon Street. What else is there?
So the three main stations to keep in mind are Euston in London, Old Oak Common, also in London, and then Birmingham Curzon Street, which we just touched on.
And there's definitely some uncertainty around at least one of those, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you're talking about Euston.
Yeah, it seems like every time I read something about HS2, there's some new drama unfolding about Euston Station.
Yeah, it's a bit of a saga.
It's become a whole thing.
So to recap, the plan was for Euston to be this grand central London terminus for HS2. But in October 2023, the government said, actually, we're not going to fund that.
Hold on, so they're building this whole new high-speed rail line, but they might not even have the funding for the main London station.
Yeah.
That's bold.
Bold is one word for it. Their plan is to rely on private funding for Euston, but so far those funds haven't exactly been pouring in.
So what happens if they can't secure the money? Do the passengers just get off the train and wander around looking for a cab?
Not quite. That's where Old Oak Common comes in. So think of this as your temporary London stop for HS2 until hopefully Euston gets built.
Right, that station in West London. Actually, I passed through there recently. It's already a very busy place.
Oh, it's going to get even busier because it's going to be a key hub for HS2 connecting to other lines like the Elizabeth Line, the Heathrow Express, Great Western Main Line. A lot of connections there.
So even without Euston immediately ready, HS2 passengers will still have options for getting around London.
Exactly.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
And then Back to Birmingham Curzon Street for a second. Thankfully, things seem a bit more certain there.
Yeah, as far as we know, that plan to reuse and renovate that historic building is moving forward, and it's going to be well integrated with the city's existing transport network. They're even extending the West Midlands Metro tram line to connect with it.
So one less thing to worry about.
Yeah.
Well, at least in that area. But even with this scaled-back version, HS2 is still a massive and massively expensive undertaking. And it's attracted its fair share of critics along the way.
That's putting it mildly. Yeah, it's definitely been a lightning rod for controversy.
So we've talked about what HS2 is, or at least what's left of it. But now I kind of want to get into the why. Why is this project, even in its slimmed-down form, still so controversial?
Well, it's the billion-pound question, isn't it? And to be fair, there are valid arguments on both sides.
So let's start with the supporters. The people who are still backing HS2, even after all the cancellations, the changes. Why are they still on board?
I think for a lot of them, it boils down to one word: capacity. Britain's railways are, let's just say, crowded, especially during peak hours.
That's an understatement.
Right. And so the argument is that HS2, these new lines, will be like adding an extra lane to a perpetually jammed motorway.
Okay, so more trains, more passengers, less overcrowding, at least in theory.
Exactly. The hope is that it's not just about those shiny new HS2 trains either. It's about freeing up space on those older lines, which could then open up possibilities for more local and regional services.
Ah, so it's like a ripple effect, easing congestion across the entire network. Makes sense.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the environmental argument, which has always been a big one for HS2 supporters.
Right, the idea that if you build it, they will come, and by they, we mean passengers who would otherwise be driving their cars or hopping on planes.
Exactly. This idea of a modal shift, offering a faster, greener alternative to those more polluting modes of transportation.
But you sent over some research on this, and one report in particular kind of threw a wrench into that argument, didn't it?
You're thinking of the Eddington report from back in 2006.
Yeah, that's the one.
And they made a really interesting point, which is that domestic air travel only accounts for a tiny fraction of the UK's carbon emissions.
So even if everyone who was planning to fly from London to Birmingham suddenly decided to take the high-speed train, instead, it wouldn't exactly be a game changer for the planet.
That's the gist of it. And of course, that's not even factoring in the environmental impact of actually constructing HS2, which, let's be honest, is not insignificant.
Right, building a high-speed rail line through the English countryside is not exactly the most eco-friendly activity.
It comes with trade-offs. Which brings us, I guess, to the other side of the coin, the arguments against HS2.
And I'm guessing these arguments go beyond, But what about the Badgers?
Well, the Badgers are important, but you're right. The opposition to HS2 runs much deeper than that. I'd say there are two main concerns that consistently come up: the impact on the environment and then those spiraling costs that we touched on earlier.
Okay, so let's unpack those one at a time. First, the environmental concerns. You sent over some really powerful articles about the potential impact of HS2 on those ancient woodlands that it would cut through.
Yeah, those woodlands are incredibly valuable ecosystems, and it's hard to argue with the images of trees that have been standing for centuries being uprooted to make way for a train line.
And it's not just the trees themselves, right? There's also the noise pollution from a high-speed rail line running through what are now relatively peaceful areas.
Exactly. It's a really complex issue, and it highlights that tension between progress and preservation.
HS2 Ltd, the company building the line, have talked about their mitigation efforts. Things like planting new trees, creating new habitats to kind of offset the losses. But is that enough to really counter the damage?
Well, that's the million-pound question, isn't it? Can you really put a price tag on an ancient woodland? And even if you could, is it simply a matter of planting enough new trees to make up for the ones you've cut down?
It feels like there's no easy answer there.
Yeah.
It's really about weighing competing values and deciding what price we're willing to pay for progress.
And that's before we even get to the other elephant in the room, those ever-increasing costs.
Yeah, we can't avoid that conversation any longer. I remember when the initial cost estimate for the full Y-shaped network was somewhere between 30 and 36 billion pounds. It seems almost quaint now.
It does, doesn't it? By 2013, that figure had ballooned to over 50 billion, then 56.6 billion by 2014.
And all of that was before they even started canceling parts of the project.
Exactly. So why the massive price hikes? Well, large infrastructure projects are expensive, for one thing.
That's right.
And land acquisition in a densely populated country like the UK is not cheap.
Makes sense.
Then there's the construction itself. Working in urban areas is complex, it's disruptive, and let's not forget about inflation, which has a nasty habit of making everything more expensive.
It really does feel like death and taxes and inflation are the only certainties in life.
Sadly, yes.
And then on top of all of that, you have to factor in the cost of the actual trains. These aren't your grandfather's steam engines. We're talking about high-tech, super speedy trains that I'm sure don't come cheap.
Not at all. It all adds up to what some might call budget creep and others might call a complete financial disaster waiting to happen.
And you sent over a report from the Okerview Review, which was that independent review commissioned by the government back in 2019 to kind of take a fresh look at HS2. And they estimated that the cost by then was likely close to 90 billion pounds.
And remember, that figure includes phase two, which has since been scrapped. So even with the smaller project, the costs are still astronomical.
Which leads to the big question, is HS2, even in this scaled back form, worth it?
To try to answer that, economists often use this thing called a benefit-cost ratio. It's basically a way of measuring the economic value of a project. It tells us if we're getting a good return on our investment.
So a higher number is better.
Exactly. And for HS2, that number has been going down and down and down. The benefit-cost ratio was originally estimated to be around 2.3, which means that for every pound invested, you'd get back more than double that in benefits.
Sounds like a pretty sweet deal, right?
It does. But I'm guessing it hasn't quite worked out that way.
Not quite. As the costs have skyrocketed and the scope of the project has shrunk, that ratio has plummeted. By 2022, it was estimated to be as low as 1.1. So for every pound of taxpayer money they spend on this, they might only see a tiny return. Not exactly inspiring confidence, is it?
Not ideal, to put it mildly, and this is a key talking point for HS2 opponents. They argue that the money could be better spent on other transport projects or on addressing, more pressing issues facing the country.
Like what kind of projects?
They point to things like improving existing rail infrastructure, investing in regional airports, maybe even exploring alternative high-speed technologies like Hyperloop.
So basically anything but HS2.
Essentially. Their argument is that it's not just about doing something, it's about doing the right thing with limited resources.
So we've got strong arguments on both sides. Capacity, potential environmental benefits versus valid environmental concerns, and those eye-watering costs. It's enough to make your head spin.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us now? With Phase 2 officially dead and the future of Euston Station still up in the air. It's like we're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding on a roller coaster.
Ooh.
But someone keeps changing the colors on the cube and adding more loops to the track.
That's a pretty accurate description of HS2 right now. I think the October 2023 cancellation of Phase 2 really did throw a wrench into things.
It did. And what about all that money that was earmarked for those canceled sections? Did they just sweep it under the rug, or?
Well, not exactly. The government has said they're going to reallocate those funds to other transportation projects, mainly under this Network North idea. The idea is to spread the love around a bit, focus on improving transport links across the country, not just on this one high-speed line.
Okay, so a more distributed approach instead of putting all their eggs in the HS2 basket. Sounds good in theory, but
But there's always a but, isn't there?
there usually is.
Critics have pointed out that a lot of the projects on this Network North list were already underway or have since been quietly shelved.
So not quite the transformative investment they're making it out to be.
It's a valid concern. And then there's the whole Euston situation. Remember how we were talking about the uncertainty around its future and the whole private investment angle?
Hard to forget when it's a multi-billion-pound question mark.
Well, there have been some interesting developments on that front, too. In early 2024, the mayors of Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, Andy Burnham and Andy Street, started talking about reviving at least part of Phase 2.
The part that was supposed to connect their two regions.
Exactly. And they're saying they want to do it with a combination of public and private funding. So they've been meeting with potential investors, trying to drum up support and prove that this could actually be financially viable.
And are those investors biting? Are they convinced, or are they running for the hills?
It's a bit too early to say for sure, but there is a glimmer of hope. The provisional report that was commissioned by the mayors, the one that came out in March 2024, suggested that a new line between Handsacre and Manchester Airport could be financially feasible with that mix of public and private investment.
So it's not completely outside the realm of possibility that we might see at least part of Phase 2 rise from the ashes.
It's a long shot, but definitely something to keep an eye on. I think this whole saga just highlights how complex these large infrastructure projects can be. The political wrangling, the economic considerations, the environmental impact, and of course the passionate views of the public. It's a lot.
It's a lot to take in, for sure. And I think you've done an admirable job of breaking it all down for us today. So for our listeners out there who have been on this HS2 journey with us, what would you say is the key takeaway from all of this?
I think the main takeaway is that there are no easy answers when it comes to these really big, ambitious projects. HS2, even in its scaled back form, has the potential to bring some significant benefits, but it also comes with some undeniable costs and compromises. Whether it ultimately turns out to be a success story or a cautionary tale, well, only time will tell.
And on that note of uncertainty, we'll leave you with one final thought. Imagine for a moment that you're the one holding the purse strings, weighing all the arguments, the costs, the potential benefits. Would you have forged ahead with HS2 as it was originally envisioned? Would you have scaled it back even further? Or would you have scrapped it entirely and invested in a different vision for the future of British transport? Something to think about, and we'll leave it right there.